Oh, thank you, Terry. Never a dull moment with Terry around, is there? Thank you, Terry. Appreciate it, buddy. All right, welcome. It's good to see you all. Welcome to those who are online, and glad to have our guests with us tonight, Pete and Danny. Glad you all are with us this evening. And so if you take your Bibles and open them to the book of Judges, we're getting close to the end of the book of Judges. We're in chapter 19, and we've got chapter 20 and 21. And that should get us pretty much through up until about Christmas season here, and then we'll get into something else when we get back after the Christmas season is over. So let me just real quick, and you know, I've got a handheld, so I don't have to worry about the wire getting hung up and snatching the microphone off my head. So I want to just kind of point out where we're at as far as the map is concerned and what we're going to be dealing with in chapter number 19. Interestingly enough, so much of what we've been studying in the book of Judges has been all located, most of it has taken place around in the center region of the Promised Land. But remember, and I pointed this out when we were going through the allotments of the land to the different tribes, that Ephraim is right in the middle of the nation. It's pretty much close to what we would call center, okay? Tonight we're going to be, this is Jerusalem right here. Now in our study tonight, the text will refer to it as Yebus or Jebus, where the Jebusites still lived at this time. It eventually becomes Jerusalem, okay? So here is where Jebus or Jerusalem is located. Here is Ramah. So the area we're going to be focusing on is right between Jerusalem and Ramah in a place called Gibeon. Now if you've got the map, Gibeah is not on there. Gibeon is, but not Gibeah. So the city that we're going to be talking about tonight, where most of the activity takes place, is in Gibeah, or the main activity. But here's an interesting thing, and I pointed this out a couple of weeks ago. Even with Samson and so forth, and then as we've been in these last few chapters, because remember these last several chapters of Judges, while there's no judge that's being spoken of, no judge that is active in these particular accounts in the latter chapters of Judges, they're there to help illustrate for us examples of just how far spiritually and morally that Israel has deteriorated during this period of time. That's the whole point of these latter chapters in the book of Judges. But an interesting thing, and we talked about this during the time we were dealing with Samson, who's the last judge recorded in the book of Judges. And we see it even in these chapters we've been in recent weeks. Most of it surrounds Ephraim. And none of it's good. And here's the deal. So you say, well, why are all these accounts happening in Ephraim that's basically right at the center of the country? And I think the point of it is, now the scriptures don't say this, but I think the point of it is that this was happening in the center of the nation, and it probably represents what was widespread throughout the rest of the nation. But it's just interesting that the accounts that we've been looking at are all focused in this particular region right here. Now, so let me get my microphone on the stand. So I want you to kind of think about something as we get started in our study tonight in chapter number 19. Now, what we begin with in chapter 19 tonight, which is the account, and you can use the first point there as sort of the title for what we're going to be talking about tonight, is a Levite who takes a concubine. That's sort of the beginning of all of what we're going to see here this evening. We won't finish with this account because it carries over into chapter 20. So we'll get into that next week as well. So you've got two chapters that are all tied together related with what we begin with this evening. But as I was talking about these accounts and how all of them are happening, what we've been looking at are right in the heart of the country, what you see is both spiritual and moral deterioration. The nation of Israel during the period of the judges, as we've mentioned, they are in that downward spiral that keeps going down further and further and further. And it just depicts their spiritual and their moral deterioration and deprivation that was so widespread. And I got to thinking about that. You know, spiritual vitality and moral vitality, true, genuine spiritual vitality and moral vitality go together. They feed one another. For instance, I'll give you an example. There's a famous quote from John Adams, our first vice president. He was vice president under George Washington. He was our second president of the United States, one of our founding fathers, and so forth. He's the one who made this statement right here that is so relevant to what we're talking about of spiritual vitality and moral virtue. He said this, quote, he said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious or spiritually minded, spiritually strong people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." And that's very true. You know, you hear a lot in the politics, you know, they're all talking about, you know, the threat to democracy and this and that, and everybody's trying to leverage that from a political point of view. Let me tell you what the threat to democracy is in America. It's the spiritual and the moral deterioration that's going on as a fulfillment of exactly what John Adams said right there. A government like ours requires that you have a citizenry that have some restraint and a sense of right and wrong and good and evil, and there's some things that you do and there are things that you don't do. When those lines get blurred, a society like ours is in danger. So one of the things we need to be praying as a church is for spiritual renewal in our nation, because without spiritual renewal, there's not going to be any kind of real moral renewal. And if that doesn't happen, we are in trouble. It doesn't matter who's in the White House. If we don't have spiritual and moral renewal in America, we're in trouble. All right? So that just kind of ties us with what was going on there. And really the point of the book of Judges and these latter chapters about how it was so damaging to the nation, true to any nation. Okay? Now, so as we get into this story this evening, we're going to start with in verse number 1, all right, and we'll read verse 1 in just a minute, about a Levite who takes a concubine. Now, before we go any further, some of you may be familiar with Judges 19, you kind of know what's coming, and others may not be, all right? I don't know, how many of you have ever read and studied the book of Ecclesiastes? You ever read, okay, Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books of the Bible. But did you know, and I can't remember who it is in particular, I think it was Augustine, I think it might have been St. Augustine, said this: Ecclesiastes ought not even be in the Bible, because it is sort of a bewildering book. If you don't spend some time understanding what's being said, it can be kind of mesmerizing and confusing. Well, y'all know I quote a lot from F.B. Meyer. I love F.B. Meyer, and great old historic Bible commentator and so forth. F.B. Meyer said of Judges 19, he recommended not even reading it because it is, in his words, so distasteful. He even says this. We'll read it in a minute. He said this: "It will be sufficient to ponder these words, the first words of chapter 19, which occur 4 times in the book, without reading further in this terrible chapter, which shows the depths of the depravity to which we may sink apart from the grace of God." So those first words he's talking about in verse number 1 says this: "And it came to pass in those days when there was no king in Israel." Now, we've heard that many times, and I mentioned this in weeks past. We usually think of that verse in relation to the very last verse of the book of Judges. Judges chapter number 21, verse 25 says this: "In those days there was no king in Israel." But in these last several chapters of the book of Judges, You hear that statement several times. There was no king in Israel. The last verse of Judges just kind of finishes it out and lets us know what was going on. That every man did what was right in his own eyes. So when you talk about the fact that there was no king in Israel, it doesn't just mean that there's not a monarch there to govern or to try to set a standard of right and wrong. In the book of Judges, it's even more important because it's saying this. There was no king in Israel, and that included God. They refused to let him be their king. They didn't even seek to follow and obey God's commandments and his word and his will and so forth. The people had just cast off restraint completely. And so it goes on and says, and it came to pass in those days when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim, which we were pointing out just a minute ago, that general area, up in the mountains. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Now, Bethlehem's just a little bit south of Jerusalem that we're pointing out on the map just a few minutes ago. All right? So here's a Levite. He, taking a concubine implies that he was already married. He had a wife. All right? So he takes a concubine, which there was a legal relationship there, mainly in the sense that she belonged to him. All right? But he was not her wife. She didn't have the standing of a wife in the house in those days. And you know as well as I do that was not an uncommon practice in these days in the Old Testament. Even many godly men in the Old Testament, men whom God used, also took concubines. I mean, Abraham did, Jacob did, Caleb did, David did, Solomon. I mean, Solomon had hundreds of wives, in addition to that, 300 concubines, and so forth. And there's a lesson that comes out of all that, because if you go through and you study those families, here's what you come to find out. Every single one of those families had major, major problems. Every one of them. And in part, it was because they had broken away from God's ideal that marriage is for a man and a woman as one flesh for life, and that is what makes the foundation of the family. But what did they do? They started to embrace and incorporate what the culture was doing. That was a danger in their day, being molded by the culture. Guess what? It's still a danger in our day. And now, fortunately, for the most part, I don't know of anybody that's, got multiple wives, and I don't know if anybody's got any concubines. But there are some of these crazies around, that are advocating for polygamy. There have been places in the country who want to legalize polygamy and so forth and so on. God's plan is a man, a woman, that's the foundation, and the family, and honor God and so forth. All of those families that I just mentioned, even of Abraham, David, all of them had major problems in their families. So we go on and we read that he took for himself a concubine from Judah. So then we move on to verses 2 through 3. And that we talk about here that they reconcile after she commits adultery. So obviously, she becomes unfaithful, all right? However, I'm going to say this before we get there. I think there was a reason why she did what she did. Not that it justifies her adultery, but I think that there was a reason why she went in that direction. And it'll become more plain as we make our way through. So here's what we read, verse 2. But his concubine played the harlot against him. So in other words, she was unfaithful. She had another relationship with a man with whom she should not have had. All right? And she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, which is where he had originally gotten her from. And so she was there for 4 whole months. Then her husband arose and went after her, and to speak kindly to her and bring her back, having a servant and a couple of donkeys with him. Now, I'm going to make a statement right here. I want you to take note where it says, and he went to speak kindly to her. Now, we're going to come back to that, okay? Because I think that all plays into why she did what she did, all right? In having an affair and then running off to daddy's house, okay? So it goes on and says, and so she brought him into her father's house, and when the father of the young woman saw him, he was glad to meet him. So father-in-law and son-in-law, they meet. Then we come to verses 4 through 10, where the concubine's father extends hospitality to the Levite. Verse 4, now his father-in-law, the young woman's father, detained him, and he stayed with him 3 days, and so they ate and drank and lodged there. Verse 5, then it came to pass on the 4th day that they arose early in the morning, and he stood to depart. But the young woman's father said to his son-in-law, refresh your heart with a morsel of bread, and afterward go your way. So they sat down, the two of them ate, and they drank together. And then the young woman's father said to the man, please be content to stay all night, and let your heart be merry. And when the man stood to depart, his father-in-law urged him, and so he lodged there again. So apparently, the Levite and the father-in-law hit it off pretty good, all right? Verse 8, then he rose early in the morning on the 5th day to depart. But the young woman's father said, please refresh your heart. So they delayed until the afternoon, and both of them ate. And when the man stood to depart, he and his concubine, his servant, his father-in-law, the young woman's father, said to him, look, the day is now drawing toward the evening. Please spend the night. See, the day's coming to an end. Lodge here that your heart may be merry. Tomorrow go your way early so that you may get home. I think they were making merry a little bit too much, all right? I think there was probably a little bit of a hangover from one day to the next, maybe. Verse number 10. However, the man was not willing to spend that night. So it's kind of moved later into the day. Should have left early, but it's later into the day. All right, so he decides, no, I'm going to leave. So he rose and departed, and he came opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem. And with him were the 2 saddled donkeys. His concubine was also with him. So that's what transpires between him and the father-in-law. So that all seems to be good, okay? Then verses 11 through 21. The Levite and the concubine depart, finally, to return home. Verse 11. They were near Jebus, and the day was far spent. And the servant said to his master, come, please let us turn aside into this city of the Jebusites and lodge in it. But his master said to him, we will not turn aside here into a city of foreigners who are not of the children of Israel. We will go to Gibeah. So let me ask you a question. In your words, what's he saying there? Why is he not going to turn into Jebus, among the Jebusites? Why is he not going there? Yeah, they were foreigners. They were still basically, they were Canaanites. All right, leftovers from the conquering of the land. Remember, we've come back to this theme over and over again. They were leftovers from the tribes not driving out the Canaanites and so forth. And even when Judah had gotten that allotment of land, they didn't attempt to try to drive the Jebusites out of there because they were too strongly entrenched. Here they are now, all these years later now, all the way towards the end of the book of Judges, all right? And so they're basically not good people and not going to look favorable to them. So we're going to go to Gibeah. Well, why would he choose Gibeah? What would be the favor of Gibeah? Do what? Safer, because it is an Israelite city. It's inhabited by Israelites, all right? Verse 13. So he said to his servant, come, let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night in Gibeah or in Ramah, which is just up the road. And they passed by and they went their way. And the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. And they turned aside there to go in and lodge in Gibeah. And when he went in, he sat down in the open square of the city. Listen to this. For no one would take them into his house to spend the night. Now, let me ask you a question. What's wrong with that statement? Here you've got an Israelite from Ephraim, all right? He's traveling on his way back home. He stops in an Israelite, a Jewish city, not a pagan city where there are leftovers of the Canaanites there and their descendants. And he goes into the city, and they have to stay in the town square because it says no one would take them into his house to spend the night. What's the problem with that statement? Now exactly. Hospitality was a big deal among the Jewish people. Still is to this day. God had told Israel, while Moses was leading the people, and God told them multiple times that they were to show hospitality to their brethren, and so that you would not have a brother and his family come to a town and have to sleep out in the city square. You take them into your home and you feed them and you care for them and you protect them and so forth. And God even gave commandments about taking care of the stranger. And so here they come to Gibeah, convinced, no, if we'd gone to Jebus there where the Jebusites are, that's a bad place and nobody's going to want us there. And here they get to Gibeah, an Israelite city, and they're completely ignored. Literally left out in the cold. All right? And so this is where the story starts to turn dark. Because this really is a dark story. Okay? Verse 16. So just then an old man came in from his work in the field that evening, who was also from the mountains of Ephraim. So here a fellow Ephraimite happens to come into town, working out in the fields. He was staying in Gibeah, whereas the men of the place were Benjamites. And when he raised his eyes, he saw the traveler in the open square of the city, and the old man said, "Where are you going, and where do you come from?" And so he, the Levite, said to him, "We're passing from Bethlehem in Judah toward the remote mountains of Ephraim. I am from there. I went to Bethlehem in Judah. I'm on my way to the house of the Lord." Now this is kind of added here at this particular point. We know he's on his way back home towards Ephraim, all right? But here he adds into the story, I'm on my way back home to Ephraim, but I'm also going to go to the house of the Lord before I go home. Now you got to remember, in those days, that the tabernacle is not located in Jerusalem, it's in Shiloh, which is on his way to Ephraim. So, well, wait a minute. Why is he going to the tabernacle? Why does he need to go by the house of the Lord? Any ideas? Any suggestions? Think about what he's dealing with. Why did he go to Bethlehem? He went to get his concubine, bring her back home, who had done what? Committed adultery. So more than likely they're on their way back to the tabernacle to go to offer some sort of a sin offering on her behalf and for purification because of her unfaithfulness and so forth, and then they'll make their way home. All right, so he adds that little bit of information there. But then he goes on and says this, "But there is no one who will take me into his house." Nobody is showing me hospitality. Here I am. I'm a Jew. I'm an Israelite. I'm in an Israelite town among Jews and other Israelites here, but nobody has shown us hospitality. So we're out here in the town square. Verse 19, "Although we have both straw and fodder for our donkeys, and bread and wine for myself, for your female servant, for the young man who is with your servant, there is no lack of anything." In other words, here's what he's saying. Here we are, we're in Gibeah, and we're in the town square. We've got plenty of food to feed our animals. We've got food to feed ourselves. We don't need anybody's straw. We don't need feed for our animals from anybody. All we need is a place to stay. We're self-sufficient. We just need a place to stay. Nobody has offered even a place to stay. Verse 20. "So the old man said, 'Peace be with you. However, let all your needs be my responsibility. Only do not spend the night in the open square. So he brought him into his house, and he gave fodder to the donkeys, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. So, hey, finally, another Israelite, a brother, shows up and shows them the hospitality that they should have received sooner rather than later. All right? Then we come to verses 22 through 26, and this is where it starts getting really interesting, where the Gibeonites commit a grave sin. Interesting, your Bible, if you look in your Bible, depending on how it might be outlined, some sections have different headings. Like, for instance, I use the New King James Version. And in the New King James Version, it says, when you get to verse number 22, Gibeah's crime. And I'm kind of like, man, this is way more than any kind of crime. This is a grave sin that takes place right here. All right? Verse 22. As they were enjoying themselves, so they're having fellowship, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. They spoke to the master of the house. That's this other Ephraimite that came along and invited him into their home. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, "Bring out the man who came to your house, that we may know him carnally." And when he entered his house, hang on just a minute. But the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, No, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly, seeing that this man has come into my house, and do not commit this outrage. Look, here is my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let me bring them out now. Humble them and do with them as you will please. But to this man do not do such a vile thing. Now, I want you to think about something. We've heard this before. Where have we heard this? Almost identical. Genesis 19. In Sodom. When Lot, remember Abraham and Lot, their herds had grown and multiplied, and they had to divide the land, and Abraham could have taken precedent, but he said to Lot, look, you choose first, and whatever's left, I'll take what's left. And Lot looks towards the city and says, oh, that's where I want to go. Okay, I want to go down towards the city. So he goes, him and his family, they settle in Sodom. Then finally, eventually, remember, the angel of the Lord comes and appears to Abraham and basically says, look, you know, the Lord's not going to hide this from his friend. I'm going to bring judgment on Sodom. And of course, Abraham goes through that whole thing. Lord, if there's 20 righteous men there, would you save? Yes. If there's 15, if there's 10, if there's 5, Lord, would you show mercy? Yes. And so the angels go into Sodom, and they go to Lot's house, and they tell him, you get everything and you pack up and you get ready. You're leaving this place, and when you leave, don't you dare look back. But when they went into the house of Lot, it says the men of Sodom came and did and used almost the exact same language as what you read right here that's taking place in Gibeah. In Sodom, they wanted him to throw the angels out there so that they could sodomize them. Here, the same thing is going on, and they're wanting this Levite thrown out there. And he says, no, but here's my virgin daughter, here's his concubine, we'll throw them out there to you, do what you want to, but you leave this man alone. Well, that doesn't, the Bible says, look here at verse 25, but the men would not heed him. No, they were like set on, they want this man, this Levite. They didn't want the women. We want that man. And so it says in verse 25, and so the man took his concubine and brought her out to them. Now I want you to think about something. Two things here. First of all, why do you think we have almost this identical, very similar episode. There are some differences, but it's very similar. Why do you think that this is included in Judges to say that this was going on in an Israelite city, in land that God gave to the Jews, that was the promised land, and so forth and so on? Why are we being told this story happening right here? What's the implication of having a very similar story that is very much like Sodom and finding it right here in the book of Judges? What's the implication?
To show how the Israelites were acting just like Sodom. I mean,
Yeah.
they're behaving the same.
It basically is saying this, that Israel, during the time of the Judges, were so morally and spiritually depraved that it was as bad in Israel as it was in Sodom. Isn't that mind-boggling? So that's one thing. But then, and you know, personally, I'll be honest with you, I've never had a whole lot of respect for Lot. Any man that would do what he was going to do and throw his daughters out there, I don't have a whole lot of use for a guy like that. Not much of a man. And you got the same kind of thing going on right here, where this father says, here's my virgin daughter and here's this concubine. They don't want that. We want him. And so now we read now that the Levite, when it says in verse 25, so the man took his concubine and brought her out to them. The Levite, he stands up, and here's what he does. He snatches his concubine, and the terminology, the term took his concubine, the Hebrew language means he seized her violently while she's in the house. He seized her violently, implying she probably put up a fight. You can imagine it probably got pretty rough there for a few minutes there in the house. He seized her violently and threw her out the door to these wicked men. Herbert Wolf, a Bible commentator, makes this statement right here. He says, one can easily see why the concubine had left her husband in the first place. She was virtually sacrificed to save his skin, as the men sexually abused her all night. Now, I'd said earlier, I think there's a reason why she left him. I don't think he was a very good man. Any man that would do something like that? Remember I told you that when she left, he went to her dad's house and he spoke to her tenderly? That's what abusive men do to the women that they abuse. Oh, baby, I love you. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. Well, which time you didn't mean to? He was one of those kind of guys. And so he throws her out. Doesn't justify her adultery, but sure enough, it justifies her leaving as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if Daddy knew about that or not. If Daddy knew about it, Daddy should have took him out behind the woodshed, is what he should have done, instead of having a party time with him. And then it says this. I tell you, this is the part of the story where it starts really getting dark. In the latter part of verse number 25 says, and they knew her and abused her all night until the morning, and when the day began to break, they let her go. Just a real quick insight. It's just really kind of interesting that as the light began to come and the sun begins to rise, they go hide. But what they did in the darkness was heinous. They didn't want either woman to begin with, but they finally settled for the concubine. And the Bible says basically two things took place right here. They knew her, meaning that they raped her, and they abused her all night. And enough said, you don't have to even think about trying to go into saying what are some of the things that they may very well have done to her, especially in this culture in which we live today with all the stuff of what we hear. You can just get an idea of what that poor woman endured the suffering, and the degradation, humility, and everything else that went on. Adam Clark said this. He describes the behavior of these men in Gibeah. He described them worse than brutes, being a compound of beast and devil inseparably blended. That's a pretty good description of them. And verse 26 says this, and then the woman came as the day was dawning and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was till it was light. And then we come to verses 27 through 30, where the Levite discovers his dead concubine at the door. Verse 27, when her master arose in the morning and opened the doors of the house and went out to go his way, there was his concubine, fallen at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, get up, let us be going. There again, I think his character starts coming through when you see something and you hear that sort of thing. But there was no answer, so the man lifted her onto the donkey, and the man got up and he went to his place. And when he entered his house, he took a knife, laid hold of his concubine, and divided her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And so it was that all who saw it said, no such deed has been done or seen from the day that the children of Israel came up from the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, confer, and speak up. And you got to ask the question, when they say no such deed like this has ever been done, well, which deed you talking about? What those men did to her? Or him cutting her up into 12 pieces and sending parts of her body throughout all of Israel to all the different tribes? And you know that there was some kind of a memo, some kind of a note telling what was happening and so forth. So here's the question, all right? Why did he do this? What was the purpose of cutting up his concubine into 12 different pieces and sending her body parts throughout the land? What was the purpose of it? What was his point?
Just to let people know what went on.
He was sending this out as a call to the nation to come and judge the Benjamites and the Gibeonites and the people who did this, that they needed to have judgment needs to come down upon them for the wickedness that was demonstrated there. Although, let me say this, I dare say that this is not the only place that similar things probably happen throughout the rest of the land, or could potentially, because I think it's just a microcosm of the sickness of the land at that time. And you got to ask, all right, well, again, the sickness of the land, what was the reason for the sickness of the land? Rather than them being what God intended them to be, they had become like the people of the land. The culture had changed them. Boy, if there's ever a wake-up call for the church, there's a wake-up call. The church, way too often, in too many instances, has been shaped and influenced by the culture. I heard one of my favorite preachers, Alan Jackson, talking about this here not too long ago. He said, I think we've probably gone too far. We've bent over backwards to try to, to show kindness and acceptance and love and so forth and so on. And he said, but I think maybe we've gone so far that we've lost some of who we are. The separateness. So he's sending this out as a call to the nation to come and bring judgment. And they do. We'll see that in chapter number 20 when we get to that next week, because this was an obviously grotesque message that was being sent out, but it was also a very grotesque sin, crime that had happened as well. And by the way, did you know that when Hosea the prophet, when he came on the scene, hundreds of years later, and when he was calling Israel to judgment and he was confronting them about their sin and their idolatry, he reminded them of this event that happened hundreds of years before. He said in Hosea chapter 9, verse number 9, he says this, speaking of the nation of Israel, they are deeply corrupted as in the days of Gibeah. He's talking about this. In chapter 10, verse 9, Hosea said this, O Israel, you have sinned from the days of Gibeah. He was calling this act right here to remembrance. But then there's this other side of the equation of this whole thing. You know, this Levite is adamant and passionate about bringing justice and judgment and so forth upon these people, as if somehow he is brokenhearted of what they've done to his concubine.
And I'm sure he left off the menu the memo that he'd shoved around.
Exactly. Where was all of this then?
Pastor, I was just thinking how he had a log in his eye.
Yeah, he definitely had a log in his own eye.
He didn't look at himself. It's like, how do you call for judgment on everybody else when you haven't judged yourself?
Yeah, he would have been more of a man if he'd been willing to die that night as opposed to what he did. So you're left with this uncomfortable feeling when you read this account right here about what has happened, that this Levite and his fellow Ephraimite, don't forget him. He's not much better because he was willing to sacrifice his own daughter and throw her out there to the dogs. So you kind of get an idea of one of the reasons why F.B. Meyer said you shouldn't even read this chapter. So it's a puzzling chapter, and so we have to just leave those two guys to God's judgment on the judgment day. All right, any questions? Comments? All right. We will conclude right there. Thank those that have been with us online. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good evening. We'll turn it over to Brother Randy, but real quick, let me just mention something real quick. We'll come back and talk about this next.